Everybody, welcome to this forum, Uncertainty in Tropical Landscapes. I would like to thank the organizers, IISA, the C4, and EU JRC and DG Klima. I'm Kriton Arsenis. I was a member of the Parliament during 2009-2014, and I worked very intensively on climate legislation, specifically on forests and biodiversity. I'm here because we have an initiative, the Roadfree, primary forest initiative that tries to work on a single issue, which is that 95% of deforestation, forest degradation, and loss of biodiversity, as you will hear in our forum, takes place within 50 kilometers from a road. So it takes just one road to destroy a forest. There's an animation of 2 minutes if you see our website, roadfree.org, and if you share the idea, you can spread also the message. So I'm very honored to be in this, moderating this panel, because this is not a forum, a theoretical forum. This is a very practical forum. We have more than 20 countries now joining REDD+ programs. We have many countries committing to reduce deforestation and to make the forest a real carbon sinks. But from commitment to realization, it's a long way. You need mechanisms, you need principles, and there are countries that have done work on this side. They have walked the talk. There are countries that are trying to do it. We are going to discuss which are these principles, which are the mechanisms that we should put in place. So we have a lot of speakers. We'll try to have brief presentations so that we can open up the debate. With no delay, I will invite to the panel David Cooper, the Deputy Executive Secretary of the Convention for Biological Diversity. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Good to see so many people here early on a Sunday morning. And of course, we're all looking forward to the governments up at Le Bourget producing an agreement that will at least begin to seriously address the climate change issue this week. And we've been hearing a lot, not only here at the Global Landscapes Forum, but also at COP21, on how forests can play a big part in this effort. Not only forests, but also other ecosystems, other biomes beyond forests in the landscape. Not only can they play a big part of the mitigation challenge, and of course this is the rationale behind REDD+, we also know that maintaining our forests and other ecosystems will be important for adaptation to climate change, delivering a lot of co-benefits, contributing to the broader Sustainable Development Goals. Under the Convention on Biological Diversity, there is a number of targets that have been adopted by governments. Most of these are targets for 2020, and they include Target 5, Aichi Biodiversity Target 5, which calls for deforestation and the loss of other natural habitats to be at least halved, the rate of deforestation to be at least halved by 2020, and where possible, brought close to zero. Another target, Target 15, calls for restoration of at least 15% of degraded ecosystems. And of course, there's a target on protected areas to expand protected areas to at least 17% of the landscape. And perhaps even more importantly, that these protected areas are not only representative, but parts of well-connected systems in the landscape. It's good to see that all of these elements of the Aichi biodiversity targets are reflected now in the Sustainable Development Goals, and we see the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development as an important enabling package for these goals and these targets. But we won't see reduced forest loss and increased forest restoration on its own. It will not happen on its own. And indeed, if you look at the 4 RCP scenarios highlighted in the IPCC's report, the 5th assessment report, of course only one of them keeps the temperature within 2 degrees. And in that scenario, we see forest area decreasing, not increasing, because of land use change, mostly for biofuels. So we cannot take it for granted that forests would play a big role. We have to make this happen, and of course that involves action by millions of actors in the private sector, farmers, forest dwellers, and billions of consumers around the world. For it to happen, we know, I think, from the experience we can see so far, that we need comprehensive policy frameworks in place. And of course, we need economic incentives, including funding, that are aligned with those policy frameworks. And to get that in place, and then also to be able to monitor and enforce whatever measures are agreed, of course, we need good science and effective monitoring, and that's going to be the topic of this discussion this morning. Again, from experience, we can see the role of good data, good science, being made available, being put in the public domain, being open access, not only important in enabling agencies to monitor and enforce commitments and plans that are agreed, but also in creating public support and the political will that enables those policies to be developed in the first place. So I think we're going to hear some interesting presentations now on the role of monitoring and how we can improve what we're doing in this domain to reduce the uncertainties, increase the confidence that policymakers and investors will need to make reality the role of forests in climate mitigation, climate adaptation, and in achieving the broader Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. And David introduced the main topic, which is good science. And we have a very good scientist, Bill Lawrence, Director of the Center for Tropical Environmental and Sustainability Science in James Cook University, and an expert on roads and their impact on forests. Bill, the floor is yours.
I'm rushing to the podium because Kriton has told us we have exactly 8 minutes, not 1 second more, so we shall see. I want to talk about, as Kriton mentioned, roads, and thanks to the sponsors, by the way, for the invitation to be here. It's a fantastic forum. And the impacts of roads on tropical forests in particular, and also on their carbon stocks, which is something that we're all very concerned about. And one of the reasons to focus on this is that we are really living in the most dramatic era of road and also all kinds of infrastructure expansion in human history ever. And in fact, for instance, it's been projected that by the middle part of the century, we're going to see something like 25 million kilometers of new paved roads, and that's enough to circle the Earth more than 600 times. And it's really quite an incredible increase in the extent of roads. And most of these roads, around 9/10 of the roads, are going to occur in developing nations. And of course, this includes many tropical and subtropical nations, which sustain much of the most biologically important and environmentally critical real estate on the planet. So the implications are obviously quite profound for all of us. I want to just very briefly mention a few things that roads do. I think most of us know this, but you can sort of talk about direct effects of roads and indirect effects of roads, and we can spend a lot of time. We know when we create a road that there's some habitat loss, some habitat destruction, from a dozen to a few dozen meters wide typically. We know that certain kinds of animals get killed by roads. There's other kinds of phenomena that are directly attributable, such as edge effects. Oftentimes, the most important consequences of roads are not actually the immediate and direct consequences, but their indirect effects, such as opening up areas to hunters, or in some cases to other kinds of individuals who would be using fire, Swidden farmers or others that would be using fire. This is just an example here in northern Bolivia. These areas here in dark are major logging roads, and the areas in red are major forest fires, and you don't have to stare at that very long to see there's a really strong relationship between where the roads are and where the fires are. This is in the Brazilian Amazon. This is looking at the increase in fire frequency as you're getting, that's 50 kilometers there, getting closer and closer to roads. That's outside of protected areas. That's even inside protected areas. You can see a strong relationship there. So we're just living in this era, in this incredible tsunami of road and infrastructure expansion happening everywhere, penetrating into many of the world's last surviving wild places. And one of the things I really want to argue is that we direly need, living in this time of this tsunami, much more strategic and proactive planning of where roads should go and where they shouldn't go, because if we don't, we're going to be in trouble. We've been working on this issue for some time. Last year we published which I think even from very much our own admission, it was sort of a wildly ambitious attempt to try to say where on earth should roads be prioritized and where should we try not to put roads, based on environmental criteria and based on the largest of all human land uses, which is food production, agriculture. Humans currently farm an area the size of South America, and we graze an area the size of Africa. So we really prioritized road expansion in places where we could maximize food production and try to limit environmental costs. That was sort of the idea behind this. And I just want to give you one example. This is published just a week ago in Current Biology. This is looking at Africa's development corridors. And if you haven't heard about this, you will be hearing about this soon. So there's been 33 of these really major development corridors proposed for Africa. The median size is more than 1,000 kilometers. The longest one are well over 4,000 kilometers in length. In total, they're going to be more than 53,000 kilometers in length. And you can see they're going to form a whole spider web of major connections across Africa. So really, there's a potential for a very profound changes. They're intended not just to be roads or railroads, but they're actually intended to facilitate development in many cases. And one of the things we wanted to do was to look at this quantitatively and say, what are the relative costs and benefits of these projects? Are they all worthwhile? And they're being advocated by people that, one set of group are people that are worried about issues like food security and population growth in places like Africa. Another set of actors are, there's a lot of huge investment, almost a feeding frenzy of investment, of foreign mining investment going into Africa now. So that's also helping to drive a number of these projects. So we looked at several things. One was human occupancy. One of our rationales is that putting roads in areas that are really sparsely populated or have very few people is not necessarily a good idea, because those areas are likely to retain more environmental values. So we laid a 50-kilometer strip over the top of each one of these corridors, and we used persistent night lights to try to estimate human population densities. We used a very low threshold, so this should be able to detect even sparse rural settlements. And one of the key messages here is that some of our sites were pretty populated, but in fact, more than 70% of the sites had a very low population density. That was surprising to us. Less than 5% of the pixels had any evidence of human population at all. Another thing that we looked at was a sort of a composite index of natural values. This is a whole set of things, just very quickly. It includes some spatial indicators on biodiversity, some things on critical habitats of various types, and also environmental services like carbon storage and climate regulation. And you put all that together, and you get this kind of surface about natural importance. So we combined those two things, human populations and natural importance, and our rationale was that, look, if you're talking about an area that has a lot of natural values and has very few people, that's probably not the best place to put a road, at least in terms of its environmental impacts. That's the kinds of places where roads are likely to cause the most profound environmental damage. And then we also wanted to say, well, where are we likely to get the best bang for the buck, the most benefits from road expansion? And so we developed a model which looks at things like yield gaps and looks at vegetation clearing in areas, looks at climate layers, looks at potential growth in future food production. And the bottom line is, these are the areas where, according to our model, we're designed to get, or one is likely to get, the most increases in agricultural production, or in many cases yield increases, and hopefully while limiting some of the environmental damage. So you end up with this map surface that looks like that. And this was explained in some depth in where it was really originally published last year. The bottom line is, when we look at our relative conservation value of these 33 corridors and our relative environmental, the benefits of the roads, what we see is enormous variation. Enormous variation. You can see here about a half a dozen of the projects we regard as flat out bad ideas. Okay, they've got high environmental values, they would have relatively low benefits. Another half dozen or so look like they're pretty good ideas, and then there's a bunch in the middle that for various reasons seem to be marginal, that maybe with very careful environmental mitigation, if that kind of thing is possible, could be justified, but I think they need to be looked at very carefully and scrutinized on a case-by-case basis. And just to sort of map these out, you can see here in the different colors,
colors, sort of some general patterns. You know, the ones that are marginal or inadvisable tend to be oftentimes equatorial or oftentimes in the eastern arc forest areas. Some of these areas that are more promising are in sort of savanna systems where there's relatively large human populations already existing. A lot of the native vegetation has already been cleared in a number of these areas. The second point I'd like to make here, or third point I'd like to make here, is that we really desperately need better data on roads. It's absolutely fundamental to everything we're trying to do with modeling road impacts, with understanding road impacts. And I just want to give one example here from the Brazilian Amazon. This was an effort we did in 2002 to try to estimate the impacts of the official paved highway network on deforestation. You can see here two things. One, there's a lot of scatter about that relationship. And two, the model suggests that we're getting effects extending possibly several hundred hectares or several hundred kilometers out away from roads, okay? That was using the official existing road network. We then went back in and actually mapped not just the official roads, but in fact all the illegal roads. And it turned out that there was actually about 3 kilometers of illegal roads for every 1 kilometer of legal roads. And once you actually mapped all those, in fact, you saw a much tighter, a much stronger relationship between where the roads are and where the deforestation is. And in fact, 95% of the deforestation occurs within 5.5 kilometers of the roads. It's telling us that the roads are having a profound impact on the pattern and pace and configuration of habitat destruction in places like the Brazilian Amazon. They're absolutely critical, and you can't get that without knowing where the roads really are. And that brings us back full circle to what Kriton mentioned, which is this absolutely vital roadless forest initiative, which is being undertaken. Kriton initially got the funding for this when he was a member of the European Parliament. It's now being undertaken by scientists at the EU's Joint Research Center in Ispra, Italy. And it's going to use a combination of remote sensing and crowdsourcing data. Here's a website here. It's also, you can go to the same one with the EU at the ending here. And we've got several people in the audience, Steve Pudell, Frederick Richard, and also Kriton, who you can talk to later if you're interested in this initiative, because it's an important one. In fact, it's absolutely vital for understanding the future of forests and for roads, and they are truly going to be a game changer in the future of ecosystems. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill. And Bill Lawrence talked about the need for good science and good data. And we have now with us Bianca Hers from Sentinel-2 Mission Manager from the European Space Agency to discuss with us the advances in satellite imaging and how this can help in protecting our forests.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here. I'm going to detail to you a bit how the Copernicus program is going to help in this environmental monitoring. Copernicus, you might know, was formerly called GMES, is a European flagship program that is led by the European Union, and it's there for operational monitoring of the environment and also for civil security. ESA, the European Space Agency I'm working for, is coordinating the space component, so anything that is related with the development and also operating, coordinating the satellites. The European Commission is coordinating the way these data are being used, producing services and information out of these satellite data and also out of in situ data. Let us directly jump into the list of satellites. You see here a long list, and everywhere where you see an S stands for Sentinel, which are individual satellite families which are supposed to measure phenomena on Earth. They're looking into landscape, they're looking into ocean, they're looking into atmosphere, glaciers, sea ice, you name it. There are various measurements being carried out by these satellites. And you see we have a long time span ahead of us. We are already looking for the time span up to 2030. And we are planning and operating the satellite. We had 2 launches. If you calculate all of what you see on the slides, every little rocket is a satellite being launched. We're talking about 25 satellites in total. We had 2 satellites launched already, Sentinel-1 and Sentinel-2. And what I'm going to do is to take you a little bit into the details of what Sentinel-2 can do in that context. Sentinel-2 is providing unprecedented data if you compare it to all the data, Earth observation data that were there before. And I'll try to explain it to you via 5 dimensions. First of all, spatial detail. With Sentinel-2 data are providing you with spatial detail up to 10 meters. You might say, I know there are satellites who are giving me 1 meter. That is right, but if you look at the other 5 together, the combination, the 10 meter is really a lot. It gives you detail, for example, on single large trees. It gives you detail on what was presented before, the roads. You can clearly distinguish any road with a 10 meter resolution and individual houses. If you put that together, the Sentinel-2 data, once the satellite is flying over a certain area on the Earth, it's covering almost 300 kilometers of swath. That gives you, once we have the 2 satellites in place, which should be in a year's time, 5 days revisit at the equator. And that really makes the difference to current Earth observation data that are out there. It gives you the repetition that you need in order to overcome things like clouds and also to see processes. Let me show you quickly 2 examples of quick looks of Sentinel-2 data over the Congo. With the 300 kilometer swath, in 400 minutes, because the satellite is flying at an altitude of 800 meters, it takes about 4 minutes to go over Congo. And if you're lucky, like in this case, you have it almost cloud-free, so you have half of your database already established. Another example here, a bit further to the east, where you see also here clearly, you can see the tropical forest, you can see the patterns in one go in a couple of minutes. If you're really lucky with the cloud-free, you have your image base. Here I'd like to show you an example. Why is it so crucial to have these 5 days revisit that we have with these satellites? This is taken from an experiment that was run by ESA together with CNES on the Spot 5 satellite, where they were simulating the revisit time of Sentinel-2. So what you'll see here, the following is an image every 5 days, and I'll start this. You see in black the rivers, you see in green the tropical forest, and in this orange color you see basically agricultural fields where you've lost the forest. And when you look at these changes here over time, you see that the landscape is changing rapidly. So in order to gather the processes that are going on Earth, you need this revisit time. You also see here on that last image, on the upper right, you see the fires, and in white you see the plumes of the actually ongoing fires. So these satellite data will really help to understand these processes and also to capture them in a timely way. Another example here by the JRC colleagues, also showing why to have the frequent revisit of these Earth observation data is so important. You see clearly again here these roads, the linear features here. The different colors, and if you blind out all the rest, are telling you are basically different dates. So what you can see here is between February 2013 and May in that same year, you can see really how fast the logging went along those roads. And that is clearly what you can see from the satellite data. So if we take the next thing, what is further unprecedented, basically what this satellite is providing, is the spectral bands. We have 13 spectral bands, which is more than any flying satellite has currently. It helps to distinguish not only where is forest, where is no forest, but it also helps to distinguish different forest types or different landscape types, different agricultural field types. So that really helps to better get an understanding on the coverage of the Earth. Another example here, also showing from Brazil this time, an example showing what you can see in the satellite imagery. There are 3 subsets that you see. One, you can clearly see the logging roads. On the middle one, you see the logging patterns and the deforested area. A further example, forest monitoring, that's what I said before, for the spectral information. The spectral information will help you not only to distinguish the forest is there or not, or there's an agricultural field or not, but it will also help you to distinguish, was there deforestation, reforestation, are there different types of forest? If you look to the lower right-hand side, there's really the distinguishing made between different types of forest, and that is again done by a service project being carried out in the course of Copernicus, called Recover and Redav. And these are examples from Mexico, Cameroon, and Central Africa. So in Copernicus, there's on the one hand the Earth observation data being provided. On the other hand, there's also the services which are deriving the required information out of these satellite data and providing information products. Fourth point, systematic land imaging. Those satellites, when they fly across the Earth, they're going to be switched on all the time. They're going to systematically produce data. And as you saw before, we're going up to 2030. It's going to be long-term. And now comes the best, free, full, and open. That is really the benefit of the program. The data, both the Earth observation data and also the information products coming from the services, are freely and openly available to anyone. And it doesn't cost anything. So that's really the contribution of the European taxpayers to the environmental monitoring. The whole program has basically cost about 4 billion in development, and currently the operations is another 4 billion, which is the contribution from Europe for environmental monitoring. If you want to access the data from these sentinels, here's the webpage. You go to sentinels.copernicus.eu. You quickly register. Anyone can download the data. There's a catalog. It should be quite easy to access these data. The only thing you need is huge hard disks, because the data is enormous. One step further, we will not stop there distributing the data. One thing we are developing now for Sentinel-2, if you look on the left-hand side, you see that image is quite hazy and quite cloudy. So what we want to do next is, in the middle, we are trying to develop, or we are in the process of preparing for an atmospheric correction to get rid of the changed atmospheric conditions, to give you always the proper reflectance, as you see in the middle image. And also, and that is a step further, that is part of the Copernicus services, they will start to do composite to get rid of those black areas in the middle, to get rid of the clouds, so get you really the best and the most composited information that you can then also compare across time. If you want to have further information, there's a couple of web pages you might want to look into. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a very interesting presentation, and it's very interesting to have always transparency of data. And this is an issue I think the next speaker will touch upon, Christopher Martius, Principal Scientist on Center of International Forestry Research, CIFOR. CIFOR is not only organizing this wonderful event, but is doing a lot of research. And Christopher is responsible for climate mitigation in CIFOR. Christopher, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Kriton, for the introduction. I'm trying to do some research sometimes in between organizing big events. I'm going to take you a little bit a step back from the data, the data question as such, and trying to discuss something that we are looking at in a joint project with several partners. Öko Institute is the lead, Wageningen University, YASA, and a few other organizations are here because they contribute to the thinking in this presentation. And basically, it's a question on how to strengthen independent monitoring of land emissions or forest areas, which is starting with a reflection on two perspectives on numbers. I'm a natural scientist, so normally you grow up in doing your studies and so on by thinking that data are the rational data. They are out there, that they're fixed, you can use them, and they describe the reality. Then come the social scientists and tell you that maybe it's not like this, because numbers are also a social construct. Numbers can be manipulated, numbers can be used to make different cases, different argumentation for different situations or for different solutions. And we need to be more aware of that. And originally, I had a longer presentation presented on this, but basically we talked about this at the UNESCO Science Conference in June this year here in Paris. So I'm just flying over this topic. But basically, if you come to reflect on the rational side of data, and this is an example of deforestation data from a country which I'm not disclosing because we are not interested in a whodunit. We're not interested in putting countries on trial. We are just interested in the assessment of a principle. And that is, if you look at different data sets for the same forest area, you get very different data on the same phenomenon, and sometimes even using the same satellite data, just using different ways of interpretation, different approaches to the data, different timelines, and so on. You get hugely differing data sets. Basically, the overlap between 3 different data sets for this rainforest area is very not very clear. So basically, coming back to the data question, is then the point to say we need a third perspective. We need to look at data that are scientific, but we have to understand there is data variation. We have to understand there is a lot of underlying assumptions that lead us to have a certain data set in a certain way. And there's uncertainty. And everybody in this room probably understands this concept of uncertainty, particularly when we talk about something like, a little bit different context, but something like 2-degree goal, then we know that's just a very, we say, we give the impression it's a very precise goal, but in fact we know there is a lot of uncertainty around this. So the data variation and uncertainty is something we should routinely consider, and we should maybe abandon the idea that science is really giving you this one totally true data set. So if science doesn't do that, then what? How can we still continue doing science and having reliable assessment of progress in climate change, for example, in halting deforestation or reducing emissions? Well, that's something which we are trying to understand better in a project which we are doing with EC funding, and we are trying to understand basically how to increase the transparency and the reliability of data in this context, in the context of land-based emissions. So the question is, if you can't say the data is what is really there out there in reality, then you have to understand data in a better form, and that means you have to have transparent access to data, open access to data, and that means also data have to be independent from interests. And so we are trying to understand and develop in a relatively small project a proof of concept. We are not developing a system, we are developing a proof of concept of ideas that should be underlying the question of independent monitoring. So we are doing several things. We are analyzing global monitoring systems that are currently available. We are looking at user needs, and we are trying, based on that, developing some case studies and then developing recommendations. So this is our assessment framework. So we look at currently available data sets and web portals that provide data, and we look at what they provide in terms of forest area and area change, biomass and biomass change, and also land use change and land use change data. And then on the other side, we look at what actually the users need. We try to understand what, we have interviews with 650 stakeholders that are in part data users, but also in part data providers, and we try to understand what they need, what they have, what they need, what they would like to have, and what kind of data set would they like to have, and also what they understand by independent monitoring, because we want to make this project interesting to data users. And so we came to a set of indicators based on these two sides of the coin, where we put some data in, and then we try to develop an analysis of the strength, weakness, opportunities and risks and gaps in each of these approaches. And from that we developed a few case studies, really a very limited set, and then this is something that's going on. So we concluded the first 2 steps, but we are now in the case study situation, and basically from there we're going to develop some recommendations. To give you just one example from the stakeholder assessment, so as I said, there was some 650 people were interviewed, and they were quite well distributed in different user groups, NGOs, governmental companies, and research. And so we found that many users actually would like to have data emission factors at tier 2, tier 3 level, so high level, highly differentiated emission factor data. But also they are different between stakeholder groups. Some groups, and basically you can see here the green areas here in government and in companies, they would be quite happy with having tier 1 data. So they're not so interested in the real high level data set. So that's interesting to know, because sometimes you don't need to go all the way to develop data sets that people actually don't need. So this is our set of case studies, which include some global case studies and some local case studies, and we're trying to understand the global contribution of land use greenhouse gas emissions and the underlying patterns, the uncertainties, and what drives them. We are trying to consolidate data at the country level. And again, we are not interested in putting countries on trial here. We are trying to understand underlying principles and trying to sort out with countries what needs to be done in order to get to more coherent data sets that everybody can agree to. And we are looking at global biomass uncertainties. We are looking at improving emission factors, particularly with soil data, and we are looking at independent monitoring for and how it can be used to develop projections of land use emissions. So in part these activities are related to each other. In part they address different questions on the local basis or on the regional basis, and some are more global. And we try to develop some underlying principles from that. So for example, if we come back to this example here, we would be looking at how the global and the national data sets compare. We try to validate the data sets using a common reference. We consolidate the estimates of deforestation, and we try to talk to the providers of the different data sets to understand why they differ and how they can be brought together in a consolidated way. So there's a lot of interactivity in this program, and this is another data set where we're looking at. This is annual data of deforestation for one of our study countries, and you can see that the data sets differ. I mean, they go more or less closely together in the first years, but then suddenly big differences pops up, and we are trying to understand why this is happening. So what is independent monitoring then in this context? For us, it's providing basically an opportunity for an independent assessment of national or sectoral data, of commercial data. It is not substituting the nationally mandated monitoring. It will help to fill country data gaps. It should provide a scientific underpinning of the data. It should be reliable and accurate. It should also increase transparency, so everybody can see where the data actually coming from. And so that should contribute to building confidence. And we also understand that there are different user needs, and different user needs means you won't have one big data set that pleases everybody for all purposes. We're going to look at a multitude of data sets, and that's probably very healthy and useful. And particularly when we see that new satellite data are coming up, and it's really helpful to be able to compare different data sources in this regard. So this is, in short, a little bit more a contribution to maybe the debate we are going to have at the end, and a few questions for you to reflect on, maybe feed them back to us later. We also have a red pavilion out there in the main hall. Actually, it's in this direction, and there will be some little events over the day, 3 45 minutes events, and one is actually also dealing with the data situation. So if you're interested in this topic, you may go there and participate in this. But these are the questions we would like to sort out a little bit with you. You know, what would be global standards if countries are setting their own performance standards? How can we assure that still this complies somehow to a global standard? How can we combine a multi-stakeholder engagement in monitoring and verification with independent control? And what might be the role of science in this? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christopher, for the work C4 and its partners is doing to establish independent monitoring for what happens in our forests and the data that is out there. There is a country, though, that has been doing monitoring of its own deforestation, and has been doing it for quite a lot of years, decades. And we have here with us Gilberto Câmara, senior researcher at the Earth Observation Directorate of the National Institute of Space Research in Brazil, to talk to us about this. Gilberto, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Kriton, and thank you for coming here, and C4 and IASA for this invitation. So, on the context of today's talk about uncertainty and reducing uncertainty on landscapes, we're going to discuss a little bit the Brazilian experience assessing this future impacts of land use in Brazil. This is most of what I'm going to present here today. It's associated with a project that has been going on for 3 years and a half now, and it's supported by the International Climate Initiative from Germany, and it is a multinational team composed of researchers from IASA, the International Institute for Applied System Analysis, the World Conservation Monitoring Center from UNEP, the National Institute for Space Research in Brazil, where I am, and the Institute for Economic Analysis Research from the Brazilian government. So it's a fairly large team and fairly qualified team. I think that everybody that I'm listing here has at least a PhD and many 30, 25 years of experience. Now, a little bit back on Brazil. So Brazil has been working with data and developing monitoring systems since 1988. And since 2002, this data has been available openly. And this is what we call transparency. And the result of that has been a substantial amount of credibility, both national and international, and also of governance. The fact that governance is extremely supported by transparency is not obvious at first, but in a democratic society, transparency is absolutely essential for the civil society to pressure the government to do things. And one of the things that we're very proud is that we recognize by countries and by, of course, the scientific community as having a monitoring system that, as science says, is the envy of the world. And that allowed Brazil to come to an otherwise very dire setting, which was a Copenhagen conference, and make a pledge, which was at least one of the few highlights of Copenhagen, that we came there and said, we're going to reduce deforestation in Amazonia by 80%, compared to what was the average for the previous years. And we're on track to doing that. So the green lines there, the green bars, are what is the, let's say, the percentual reduction if we consider, let's say, a minimum cost, minimum effort path. And the brown bars are effectively the measured data. So Brazil is still on track, but of course, Brazil has to make an extra effort. We reduced a lot, and we still have to make an extra effort to reach the 4,000 square kilometers per year in Amazon. But this was, let's say, important for Copenhagen. When it came to the INDC time for Paris, we needed, first of all, to go after 2020. So 2020 is already done, let's say in that way, but we need to ask ourselves what happens after 2020, and what about the rest of Brazil? So we, let's say, we're very fortunate to then partner with IASA and with the support of the German government. And IASA has developed for many years a model called Globiome, which is called a Global Biosphere Management Model, which is a model that assesses land use, but based on commodity trade and based on how much people would consume. So the assessment here is based on the idea that someone uses land for some purpose, either, for example, for producing wood or for producing crops or livestock, and this is consumed somewhere, either in the country or abroad or sold abroad, And we have to find out how these changes in commodities, prices and quantities would affect land use and vice versa, taking into account detailed land use policies. So that's the, let's say, the base of GLOBIOM. And for Brazil, what we did, there was a major effort from the Brazilian team to adapt GLOBIOM for the Brazilian situation, including classes which were not in the original GLOBIOM, such as forest regrowth, which are quite important for this adaptation debate and mitigation debate. So we start in 2000, validate our data for 2010, and then project it for the next decades. And we have representations of both forests, cropland, pasture, regrowth, and so on. So we start in 2000 building base maps, and of course we're helped by the fact that Brazil is a data-rich country compared to most, that we have the census data, we have monitoring. Still was a lot of effort, I can tell you that. If you want to hear more or read more, there's a brochure and there's a full document which is available on the website. We are happy that we did a good validation. This is essential for the modeling, and the modeling was validated, for example, compared what we predicted from deforestation, projected from deforestation, and what actually was measured by INPE with PRODES, our monitoring system. So there's a fair assessment, and that goes also for the croplands, livestock, and so on. So that gives us confidence, not that we are right, but that we are not completely wrong. So in that sense, we were asked in the run-up to the INDCs the following question by the Brazilian government. What is the effect of the rule of law? It might be a trivial question, but still a tough one. What happens if Brazil enforces its forest code? To wrap up, for those who don't know, the forest code in Brazil dictates that there is a mandatory protection of areas inside private lands. And this mandatory protection is what we call their reserva legal, legal reserve, and the legal amount of percentage of legal reserve would vary according to biomes. And on top of legal reserve, there are permanent preservation areas which have to be preserved, for example, in buffers along rivers. And the percentage of private farm, well, the percentage of legal reserve varies across biome. In Amazon, it's 80%. In other biomes, it's 20%. In some other places, it's 35 or 50%. So this is a question. And what happens if someone has cut more than what it deserves? The law says he has to comply and restore the forest. So this is, so the question is, what happens with Brazil? And this is what comes out of a very careful and detailed, and after, of course, lots of runs and frustrations, you come up with this idea that if Brazil keeps the business as usual without the rule of law, and if Brazil enforces the rule of law, you have a huge difference. In this case, a 30 million hectare difference by 2030. It's a huge difference. And in that case, we are happy to report that, you see, the forest code helps preserve forest. In the same sense, the forest code helps preserve, helps to force pasture intensification, but still does allow for proper expansion of croplands. There is no, at this point, a conflict between crop production and forest protection, because Brazil has a huge area of cattle which can be used as intensification grows for cropland expansion. This led us to work with the Brazilian government and project that by 2030, Brazil's emissions from whole country associated with land use change and forests are going to be 100 million tons of CO2, and they will be negative from 2035-40 onwards. So this is what it came out of the Brazilian INDC. So this data was directly used for the Brazilian INDC as part of Brazil's commitment to Paris. So everything was come out of really science-based data analysis. And what leads us to believe that this is what it's called going to Denmark. How do you get to Denmark? Not Denmark, Denmark, but that mythical country where everything works. So So you have to have an equilibrium. You have to have a state, a strong state, which is powered by technical staff. You have to have the enforcement of rule of law that limits power, and you have to have public accountability in the society. It is only when you have the three parts working together that you can hope to achieve the ultimate goal of protection of forest, but also with the enforcement of science. Without just the science being produced and a strong state, but without the rule of law, and more importantly, without full and open public accountability, we get nowhere. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Gilberto, for this great presentation. And now moving to Martin Tandoum to see the experience from other countries and how other countries can give us lessons, or it can take lessons from our experience of other countries also.
So thank you and good morning, everybody. I would like first of all to thank the organizer for having invited us to present the experience of the Congo basin on the use of the modeling to capture the future deforestation and the impact on biodiversity in the Congo basin. So this is just the background. As you know, Congo basin is the second largest rainforest tropical. And one of the particularities of the Congo basin is that we have historically the low deforestation rate compared to other regions. And also, the Congo basin country shows the strong interest for the REDD+. And as we know, the methodological requirement for REDD+ is basically based on that, the definition of the reference scenario, and also development of the MRV, a strong MRV system, and the establishment of the information system on safeguard, and also the development of the national REDD+ strategy. And concerning the definition of reference scenario, based on the particular the context of the Congo basin. So the position of the COMIFA country is that we have to take into account the historical deforestation rate and also the future development policy of the countries. And even if we have in the COMIFA countries the low deforestation rate, many of these countries are engaged for the development of the economic development and social development of the country. And this is through different, we have the mining exploitation, and also we have a development of industrial agriculture, and also many also issue that is taking place, and this putting the pressure on the forest. So why we use the modeling approach? This is through the REDD+ projects that have been presented by Gilberto with our partners, the IASA and UNEP CMC. So we use this model to try to capture the future of the land use in the Congo basin, and based on the globiome, that is the model developed by the IASA. So this model was adapted to the Congo basin context and used to predict the future land use. And show in that figure, we have the entry data, the population, the income, and the preference, and also the demand and supply of the market. And this is have the impact on the crop pasture plantation. And we have those, so the impact on deforestation and also on biodiversity loss. That was the methodology used. And for the result showed that for the 2000, from the 2000, the period 2000, the first period is from the 2000 to 2010, and that is the historical period. But for the future, the period of 2010 2030, so we show that the results show that we have the increase on the deforestation from the 600,000 hectares to 900,000 hectares. So from the period of 2000 to 2030. So we have on this map, we have the different area where the deforestation can occur in the Congo basin. And also, the results show that we have the impact on the biodiversity loss. So for this map, we have the modeling distribution of deforestation in the base scenario over the period 2010-2030. And this, we have the great ape potential habitat in 2010. And if we combine the two maps, so we have this map where we have the model impact of land use change on great apes potential habitat in the Congo basin. And concerning the assessment of scenario on several objectives, so we have this objective that have been developed: the food security and economic development, climate change mitigation, biodiversity conservation. And also we test the scenario, different scenario, high population and GDP growth, and so on. And with different scenario, so we have this one in the green. That the green is the scenario that can have the good to reach the objective. So the objective to stabilize the agriculture by the intensive crop yield and the low population increase. So that should be the scenario suggested that can be implemented in the Congo basin, so to reduce the pressure on the ecosystem and the biodiversity. So based on that experience, what we can say is that the modeling is an important tool that can inform decision makers with analysis of impact of economic activities on forest cover, biodiversity, and the land use change. And this is based on a better understanding of the land use change that can help the policymaker to make the good decision on the land use change in the Congo basin. So thank you. And thanks to all the partners, the technical partners, and also our funding partners that support us for to experience these tools in the Congo basin.
Martin did not only deliver a very good presentation, but he did it also in respecting very much our time for discussion, our time to open the floor for you. And we thank him very, very much for this. He only took 6 minutes. Now we heard from Brazil, we moved to the tropics in Africa, and now it's time to move to Indonesia. And I'm very happy to have with us Nur Masripitan. Nur is the Director General of Climate Change in the Ministry of Environment and Forestry of Indonesia. Nur, the floor is yours.
Good morning, colleague. I would like to thank to ESI and partner for inviting me to be here. And based on the invitation that I received, I supposed to give a closing remarks from all the presentation from the perspective of policy formulation and also implementation, and bring to the context of Indonesia. I would like to repeat what colleague already mentioned, that climate change is science-based. So how we deal with climate change issue need to use also science. From all the presentation, we could see how science and technology has continuously developed, and we are blessed with that development. Now the challenge is how far is our capacity and resources that available to us. If we talk with the context of country, to use the blessing of the development of science and technology. Colleague from EU mentioned that there is data available, freely accessible, and of course that need to be a process. And again, the issue of capacity and resources to interpret, to process the data to become information that ready to use for different purposes. We heard that models have provided policymakers option to consider what's the most appropriate that the government use to decide. So models is very useful, especially in the complex issues like land use change, and forestry. But model also depend on the input, the data that we use, the assumption involved, are already mentioned. So the policymakers, also managers, need to be further provided with more understanding how to best use the models and how far we could rely on the models. So again, transparency, etc. is involved in this case. It was an interesting presentation from Christopher, I think, about the perspective of numbers. Our decision makers back home were overwhelmed by the media coverage about the emission from forest cover in our country last 3 months. There was media said that our emission during 3 months is the same as the emission of Germany for one year. And people react differently. Many of them really disappointed, even angry. But for us, let's try to understand where the data come from and how they calculate or estimate the emission. And we found that a number of people estimate the affected area ranging from less than 500 hectare to more than 2.5 million hectare. And then again, the estimate of emission. So it's really, modeling is really a very helpful, very useful tool, but need to be used wisely. And about the transparency, we have experience with keeping or ensuring the transparency, clarity, and providing the readers, public, to understand about what number or the numbers that we put in our document. In this case, we have a document forest reference emissions level that we didn't include forest fire because very high uncertainty that happened to estimate of emission from the pit fire especially. But we include that in our biennial update report, so public could see or could understand from that two documents. And then we also producing the briefing paper. We give the title Understanding the Estimate of Emission from Land and Forest Fire in Indonesia, especially for 2015, so that when the public use that three documents, so that they can compare, so they can use wisely based on the purpose. And also about the use of the number or the method. It was mentioned that the government tend to select the simple one. Yes, we want to have to use the simplest one because we consider also the practicality aspect and the cost involved when this involve measuring, etc. So this is the reason why the government tend to choose the simpler approach or model. With that, I would like to close with a few messages for all of us. All of us need to be educated in using models or in interpreting the data that come to us. We need to be really wise enough to use that. Researchers could develop a model as complex as possible because this is their task. But they need to advise the policymakers what is the strength and what is the weaknesses of the models, so that the policymakers could select themselves which one they could select. And then the government, okay, because of many considerations, we choose the simplest one, but we need to realize that the simplicity also contain some high uncertainty that we could consider. Usually, the mature, the experienced decision makers and managers with simple models, it's enough for them to make decision. So, with that, I would like to close that both scientists, the governments, NGO, private, we are all important and we have to work together. That's all that I could say. Thank you very much. Good morning.
I would like to thank very much Mrs. Marsipati. And now I would like to welcome all the speakers to come to the panel because it's your time. Everyone learned that only yesterday afternoon, they learned that they had to limit their time from 10 minutes to 8, and they did that overnight. And they did this for you so that we have time to discuss. And now it's your time. We will take 3 questions at a time. And please, because we have limited time, try to avoid repeating same questions. So who would like to start? Yes? Is there someone to give the microphone? Thank you. Mika is one of the organizers on behalf of the European Commission, but he's going to take this to fill in the gap.
Thank you very much. I have a question for Mr. Câmara. I like especially 2 slides, the last one with the triangle and one with the targeted deforestation rate and the actual deforestation, the one which was observed in the previous year. I had the occasion to discuss with some of your colleagues from INPE, and we came to the conclusion that, in fact, the decrease of the deforestation rate that we observed in the past was synchronized with more or less the period of presidency of Lula. So, and now we observe that it starts to increase again. So do you confirm that there's a link between the, the politics and the deforestation rates?
And if you can say also your name and capacity, please, always.
My name is Carlos Duassej, and I work in Central Africa.
Thank you. We'll take another 2 more questions, and we'll bundle them. Yes? Someone else wants to take the floor? Yes, please. Please state your name and capacity.
Yeah, Daniel Müller from Leibniz Institute of Agriculture Development in Halle, Germany. Thank you all. I have a follow-up question on this. For Brazil, it's a general question to all, but mainly to Brazil. We can see that the exchange rate, the Brazilian real, is falling. It's in free fall again, which implies that for export commodity crops, soybean, beef, profits in Brazil, domestic profits become way higher, in particular for the large agribusiness companies who will respond to that. And in the past, there's a lot of evidence that exchange rates have driven substantial deforestation in Brazil. So what about the next few years when agribusiness will react to this increase of profits?
Thank you very much. And gentleman there.
Asim Zia from University of Vermont. I also have a question for Brazil and Congo model applications of Globium. Essentially, if you look at the last 60 years, the prices of the international commodities basically have a strong correlation with the deforestation. So I'm wondering what kind of price projections were used for projections.
Thank you very much. Gilberto, the floor is yours and yours alone for the moment.
Okay, let's start from the last one and then go back to the toughest one. I think there is one effort which has been clearly marked, is the differentiation between different kinds of farmers in Brazil. What you have in Brazil for associated with commodities is a very highly technified and capitalistic sector, which is extremely internationalized. And these kinds of producers do not want environmental problems with them. So they have an alliance of soybean producers who would actively participating in enforcing that soybean production does not, let's say, go over deforestation in the Amazon. In fact, the Globium projections are that Amazon will not be the place where soybeans and corn and sugarcane will go. So I think I don't see particularly the issue of commodities as a major problem, provided that the market control, the market chain control continues to be in place. So the crucial thing for exports of commodities has to do with market controls. And the other issue is much easier to control the production of large-scale commodities because they're much easier to monitor using remote sensing. So that I don't see the exchange rate, I don't see as a major problem. Now, the major problem, going back to the first question, is overall governance at the country level. You have to remember that the Amazon is bigger than Europe. So the governance at the country level and the scale of the Amazon, especially finding out that contrary to, let's say, what we call urban legend, deforestation in the Amazonia is driven by livestock and not by soybeans, and certainly nothing to do with biofuels. So, and they're much more difficult to control, and they require huge amount of effort on the part of the monitoring. So any let's say, economic crisis, any reduction on budget in Brazil has clearly, and I don't associate this with Lula and the president, I associate, yes, with the need for keeping a huge amount of money invested in monitoring, controlling every bit of the country. So this is a huge task, and the fact that we actually had an economic crisis, I don't associate this necessarily to one leader, but the fact that the effort to continue monitoring a country and command and control is tremendous and should not be underestimated by anyone, not least by ourselves. So, I mean, the fact that you succeeded in the past does not give you success in the future. It would be only if we had a major control of the livestock chain that we could have a better, be a little bit more tranquil for the future.
Thank you very much. Would anyone else want to come into these issues? No? Other questions from the panel, from you? Yes, please, the lady on the back.
Thank you. My name is Pieter Verwij. I'm based at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. I have a question to Mrs. Bianca Hirsch from ESA. I'd like to know what the technical possibilities are to get a better grip on the process of forest degradation. Because if we can't do that, we can't get a proper quantification of forest degradation. A large part of the emissions related to that process go unnoticed.
Okay. Very important issue, forest degradation. Any other question on that? No? So, Bianca, the floor is yours. Okay. Yes, we'll take the second one.
Oh, yeah, thank you. My name is Jean-Paul Kibambe. I'm from Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC. I have a question about road and roadless forest. We know that in many Central African countries, and mostly in DRC, the deforestation or forest cover loss is kind of co-located with roads. And of course, we all need to have roads that have less impact on forest cover loss. But how much does it cost to build a roadless forest, than build a normal road somewhere? Because politics always ask about that. Okay, that's nice, but how much does it cost? Is that the same price or higher than build a normal road? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And there's a gentleman here.
Martin Herold from Wageningen University. I have a question. It was great to see the INDCs coming out, and there was a nice analysis done to look at also the contribution of the LULUCF, so the land use sector, to the INDCs. One thing that came out is that there's probably only a handful of people in the world that understand the complexity of what has been proposed, what data it's based on, what way it has been accounted, analyzed, and so on. So we see a large diversity that very few people understand. So based on that very bottom-up process of INDCs, and that hopefully with the climate agreement actually leading to actions, what do we learn from that? I mean, what are going to be processes that can help us to better get, not only on the national level, but also on the international level, an understanding on what people plan to do and what people are actually doing, with hopefully a climate agreement in place. I know that's not an easy question, but I'd like to panel maybe to reflect on that a bit.
This was almost the whole topic of our forum, but of course people will have more comments. So we have 3 questions, and it's for Bianca, for Bill, but I think for everybody.
Okay, I'll start with the question on the forest degradation. With the satellite that I've been showing, the Sentinel-2 data, what you have here is actually spectrally, we have 13 spectral bands that will really help to distinguish, say, the composition also of forests, or the different types of forests. You have different reflectance rates, and if they change over time, which you will be able to monitor since you get data every 5 days, you will be able to see that. If not, of course, Sentinel-2 data are impacted by clouds. There's that impact. You can add Sentinel-1 data, radar data on top of that, which will also help you to get better information on the status of the forest. And then looking out into the far future, maybe going a step beyond what Copernicus is doing. Still in ESA, we are preparing additional missions, one of them being biomass, which will actually look, in fact, at the biomass, and which will, of course, provide benefits also for tropical forests and measure the degradation.
Okay. So I'll respond to the question about the roads in the DRC, or just generally. It's a very good question, which is, what is the cost of not building a road? And there's a sort of a field of science that revolves around these kinds of questions. But the key question is, what are the opportunity costs of not doing something, logging, mining project, or road building, whatever? And I think one of the things that we really need to have a better skills at and capacity is addressing exactly that kind of question. Because if we're going to try to say that there are some places in the world where we don't want roads to go for whatever reason, then we're going to have to ask, what are the costs associated with that? Now, the costs depend on, well, obviously what profits could be made if the road goes in. So if it's timber, it's going to be one set of costs. If it's oil palm, it's going to be another set of costs. If it's, et cetera, et cetera. So, and distances from markets and all kinds of things play into these things. But we need to know these kinds of things. We need to be able to model them because, in an ideal world, what we want to be able to do in some circumstances is somebody's going to have to pay if there are going to be certain places where roads are not going or where roads are even closed in some circumstances. And, carbon money would be one example where that's an obvious thing. Now, one of the real challenges is going to be, because we've got crops like oil palm, which are extremely profitable, what happens is it becomes harder and harder for carbon money and other kinds of conservation money to compete with that. So the opportunity costs become higher. But the carbon money may become very pivotal in some circumstances, such as areas that are further from markets or where the soils are more marginal, climates are more marginal, that type of thing. So I think we have to, this gets right at the heart of the kinds of questions we need to address, and I guess the kinds of questions of why we need to have better data on where roads are, where roads don't occur. I guess to me, from a biodiversity, from a conservation carbon perspective, if we don't, what we're actually seeing now is an incredible avalanche of roads going everywhere. And there's very few places even, you put your finger on what you think would be like the last wild places on the planet. In fact, more and more we're seeing these areas are being opened up. So the world's going to be opened up like a filleted fish if we don't come up with some strategies for limiting this. And I think there's a strong global interest in seeing this. It's just a question of how we're going to get there.
Thank you. Is there any comment on the third question about INDCs? Yes, Gilberto.
Martin, it's actually an urban legend that Albert Einstein said the science must be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. But I think there's a fair grain of truth. I have experienced a lot, worked for many years with land use modeling, and I only turned to Globion when all the other simpler models failed. So the problem is that there's no way you can answer a complex question with simplistic means. So I don't think it's dumbing down, like the Americans say, that we're going to get anywhere. Land use problem is a complex issue involving legislation, rule of law, trade, chains, and it's only, let's say, enforcing our capacity to the utmost and building models that need to be as complex as the problem are, that we can get a grip on this tough issue. So I don't see a way of dumbing down the problem. And by the way, about degradation, that's an urban legend. If you cannot say that degradation is a major problem causing emissions if you don't have data about it. It's a guess, and I'm willing to dispute this guess any day, not now, but I'm willing to put money on it. But that's another issue.
Thank you. There have been some new articles on this issue regarding the sequestration of tropical forests and certain species that are there that sequestrate differently than the quantities are greater than in other forests. Any other questions? Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Hannes Böttcher. I work at Öko-Institute in Germany. I have a question to Gilberto on the tool and complexity. Global markets are causing often leakage of environmental policies that are implemented nationally. With a global tool like Globiome, you can of course also assess the leakage, not only internationally, but also maybe within the country, so from the Amazon to other regions. Did you analyze that? And then the second question would be, how do you incorporate this in an INDC? And this is maybe also a general question, how can countries address the leakage issue in their INDCs?
Okay, I think that the issue in Brazil, I'm sorry.
Hi, Cyril Kormos from the Wild Foundation in the United States. I just wanted to follow up on the question about degradation, which seems very, very important. We've got recent literature indicating that degraded forests have 30 to 70% less carbon than intact primary forests, which seems like an enormous part of the equation. We also have recent articles indicating that without protecting intact forests and reducing degradation, combined with restoration, we're going to have a very difficult time making the transition from fossil fuels to a truly decarbonized economy. So just thoughts on the panel on how we can address degradation more effectively and reintroduce it in the debate, because we're doing a very good job of talking of deforestation and restoration, but it seems like the degradation aspect is unfortunately really missing.
Thank you very much. Now we open to the panel. We have only 5 minutes, and I need half a minute for the closing. But a very quick statement from Gilberto and everyone else.
Okay, so back to Hannes. In the case of Brazil, with Globiome Brazil, we have not yet analyzed the leakage. But in general terms, for the Brazilian case, the demands for croplands have been met inside Brazil. So we did not see a reduction of the need for croplands that would lead to leakage elsewhere directly. So that's the short answer. The report would tell more about this. On the degradation, I want to see the data. These reports are like the reports, you come up with some numbers. Are they good or not? I want to see the data, and I want also these reports to answer the following question. How much of the degradation that you see today will turn into deforestation tomorrow? So unless you have a multi-year assessment, a very true 10-year to 15-year assessment, any paper that picks a degradation a certain date and makes statements out of it is not scientifically sound.
Those are fair points. There are data sets out there in terms of people like Jack Putz have led meta-analyses of how much carbon loss or storage occurs in log forests and multi-cycling, single-cycle logging. Greg Asner has looked at, for instance, in probabilities of forest conversion after logging. So there are data sets, but Gilberto is exactly right that we need the data. But to respond to Cyril's comment about, degradation is a big issue, and there's different forms of degradation. The industrial selective logging is probably the biggest. There's around 400 million hectares of tropical forest in some kind of legal logging estate as well, but there's also fragmentation effects, there's surface fires, there's all kinds of other ways that forests can be degraded. There's a very interesting paper led by Richard Houghton that just came out in Nature Climate Change. I just want to mention this as the number because what it to me crystallizes how important tropical forests could be in a global warming solution. And it basically argues this: over the next 50 years, if we got really serious about conserving tropical forests, and it's not just stopping deforestation or greatly reducing deforestation, it's also about fostering the recovery of forests that have been degraded in various ways. But the argument is we could basically meet half of the CO2 emissions reduction that we need to meet over the next 50 years, okay? And that happens for two reasons. One is if you run the numbers in terms of the amount of degradation. Tropical forests are large and they grow year-round, so they can absorb carbon quickly. Now you could argue this is pie in the sky, but the bottom line is if you actually run the numbers according to this analysis in Nature Climate Change, we could go a long way towards meeting a transition towards a quote-unquote fossil fuel world, or a world that's less dependent on fossil fuels, by conserving and protecting and allowing the regeneration of, say, log forests. Unfortunately, what's happening now in many cases is many log forests are eroded and extremely vulnerable, and in many places are subsequently being cleared. They're not being regenerating, they're going the opposite direction. So we certainly have our challenges in front of us.
And and Gilberto may add to this, but I think it's something like 26% of the Amazon that has been deforested is now under some form of natural regeneration. I think that the some recent data show that. So just building on what Bill said, if you can allow that to continue, if you can build on that, then there's an enormous potential for contributing to mitigation. And just a comment on an earlier question about the INDCs and about the huge variability, perhaps in quality of them, and in the there's few. I think looking at land use change contributions that are as rigorous as the one presented by Brazil. I guess this emphasizes the importance, the opportunity to update and revise and further develop those INDCs, and I think the mechanisms within the Climate Convention for, on the one hand, mutual learning and capacity building, but on the other hand, for scrutiny, for examination, for multilateral review of what each country is doing is going to be important in, over time, improving the quality of those INDCs.
Yeah, I would like to comment on degradation. Indonesia include the degradation in our forest reference level, so deforestation, degradation, forest degradation, and also peat decomposition. So we apply that especially for our production forest. So there's we call it the degradation level 1. The change for from our natural forest when the logging happen. So if Brazil want to see about the data we use, I think will be good to assess our forest reference emissions level. Will be good. Thank you.
Just a comment about the degradation too. There are huge areas out there that are under selective logging or reduced impact logging, and they show up as degraded lands on as the same signal as degraded land degraded by not intended intended logging, but logging not intended under a sustainable management plan. So we need to find ways of differentiating that, and that's one of the things we are working on. The other point maybe is also to go back a step and say, well, I mean, these things sometimes take a dynamic on their own. I mean, we're not focused on degradation, but and we're focusing on certain elements of tropical forests, but might be also important to look at other important carbon stock areas that are out there, like peatlands in the tropics. Everybody talks about those right now, but there are also peatlands in temperate areas where huge amounts of carbon are stored or have been stored, and there's very little talk about those areas in this context. And so if you look at high density carbon areas, it might be worth looking more into this than into actually trying to maximize carbon in all cases in tropical forests. Let's just take a more general, more broader approach than just focusing on the tropical areas alone.
Thank you. I would like to give the floor also to Mika Vaki from the DG Klima, the Director General of the European Union on Climate Change, European Commission, one of the co-organizers of the event. Mika.
Thank you very much, Kriton, and thanks to all on behalf of the Commission for being there on an early Sunday morning on a very technical